What happens when a kingdom's deepest secret is finally exposed through a single dance? Watch as a maid's kindness shatters the Wolf King's world and ignites a journey that will change everything. The great stone walls of Darkwind Castle loomed like silent sentinels, their jagged peaks cutting into the pale sky. It was a fortress of power and tradition, built from the bones of ancient kings, yet beneath its grandeur lay a darkness, a silence that had stretched for years, wrapped in the shadows of grief and neglect. Inside, the royal court was a well-oiled machine, its members sleek and polished like wolves in their finest furs, all of them with their own agendas, but none daring to approach the one figure who remained untouched by their world. At the center of the ballroom, where the grand chandeliers hung like frozen stars, Princess Liora stood alone. The grand waltz swept around her, a blur of silk and jewels, but Liora was still, her pale fingers fidgeting with the hem of her crimson gown. Her eyes, bright and haunting, remained distant, as though they could see something beyond the dance, beyond the false smiles and rehearsed laughter. She had lived in the shadows of this court for as long as anyone could remember, a silent figure trapped in a world that didn't know how to understand her. King Kalen, her father, watched from his throne, tall, imposing, his eyes ever watchful. His kingdom feared him, his people revered him, but his own flesh and blood, his daughter, was something different, a flaw he had never quite known how to fix. He had locked her away, kept her isolated in the silence of the castle, hoping that the world outside would forget her, just as he had been trying to forget the haunting pain of losing his queen. Yet, as the night went on, the silence seemed to grow heavier. Liora, unnoticed by most, drifted between the courtiers who spoke past her, never looking her way, never acknowledging her existence. It was as if she wasn't even there. The rhythm of the world continued to pulse around her, but she was alone, stuck in a moment of time, untouched and unloved. Before we continue this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and tell us, what city are you watching from? We'd love to hear where our viewers are tuning in from. Then, from the corner of the room, Liora, a young maid with simple clothes and unpolished shoes, watched the scene unfold. The newcomer, full of quiet resolve, caught Liora's gaze. Something inside her stirred, something unfamiliar, a longing she had never expected to feel for a royal child. She had been warned, of course. The head housekeeper had spoken to her, voice low and stern. "Stay away from the princess. She's different. She doesn't speak. She doesn't like to be touched." But Liora didn't care. She had seen too many people left in the shadows, abandoned to their own silence, and she couldn't stand it anymore. So, with a silver tray of wine in her hands, Liora made her way through the crowd, her heart pounding. As the music swelled, a waltz of haunting beauty, she reached the farthest corner of the ballroom. There, in a shadowed alcove, stood the princess, her back straight, her gaze unblinking. Without thinking, Liora stopped, set the tray down, and approached the princess with a slow, careful step. "Would you like to dance with me?" Liora asked, her voice gentle, yet full of warmth. The words were simple, but they carried more weight than anything Liora had heard in years. For a moment, there was nothing, no movement, no sound, just the quiet presence of the two women, alone in the sea of life around them. Then finally, Liora's fingers trembled, and with a barely perceptible movement, she extended her hand. Liora stood, cradling the small hand in her own as if it were made of glass. With a tender, practiced motion, she led the princess toward the center of the ballroom, far from the swirling dancers, but close enough to feel the music's pull. It was a dance unlike any other, the rhythm not set by violins or the beating of hearts, but by the trust they began to weave in that silent moment. As they moved, Liora could feel the weight of eyes on them. The court was no longer the same. It had shifted. Conversation stopped, eyes followed. Even the music seemed to soften, as if the entire kingdom was holding its breath, waiting for something to change. At the edge of the crowd, King Kalin stood, his jaw tightening, his hands clenched at his sides as he watched his daughter for the first time in years. She, who had been a source of shame, now danced, not just with a maid, but with the most human part of herself. A wave of emotions surged through the king. Grief, wonder, terror, all at once. He had spent years trying to protect his daughter, not realizing that in doing so, he had kept her locked away. She was no longer the silent, unseen figure in the shadows. She was moving. She was breathing. She was real. And for the first time in years, Princess Liora smiled, a fragile, fleeting smile. But real. Something that had been buried deep within her began to rise to the surface. The dance, though simple, was a bridge. A bridge between father and daughter, between a king and the love he had been too afraid to embrace. As the night stretched on and the courtiers began to whisper amongst themselves, Liora remained beside the princess. Unbeknownst to her, she had just shattered a curse that had lasted for 7 years. And as the music played, the castle would never feel the same again. The night of the Crimson Court marked the beginning of a new chapter, not only for Princess Liora, but for the Wolf King and his kingdom. The dance was more than just an act of kindness. It was the key to unraveling years of grief, fear, and silence. But what Liora didn't know was that the story she had begun to write with one simple question, "Dance with me," was one that would change everything. And as the court's whispers settled into the night, Kalin's journey to rediscover the daughter he had neglected had only just begun. The corridors of Darkwind Castle stretched endlessly, a labyrinth of high stone walls and flickering torchlight. For Liora, the maid who had only just joined the service of the royal court, the place still held an air of mystery. The grandeur was undeniable. Ornate tapestries adorned the halls, depicting battles won and legends made, while suits of armor stood like sentinels in every alcove. But for Liora, the castle's magnificence was marred by something deeper, something that pulsed in the air like a forgotten ache. It was the silence. She wasn't quite sure why, but from the moment she set foot inside the castle, she sensed an unspoken tension that clung to every corner, every word whispered behind closed doors. The servants moved swiftly, their eyes cast down, their voices hushed, and the nobles were no better. They glided through the castle like shadows, their faces perfect masks of politeness and cold detachment. Yet something lingered beneath their facades. A secret, a sorrow, a wound they all pretended wasn't there. And then there was Liora. Liora had seen her from a distance at first, always alone, always in the shadows of the grand hall, her pale form barely visible against the dark drapes and the opulent surroundings. The princess never spoke, never moved unless guided by others. She existed in a world entirely separate from the one around her, and everyone seemed to leave her there, forgotten and unseen. But unlike the other servants, who steered clear of the princess, fearful of upsetting the delicate balance of the royal household, Liora felt a pull. It wasn't just curiosity. It was something deeper, a quiet understanding, a recognition that Liora was not a mystery to be solved, nor a burden to be avoided. She was a person, someone who had been left behind in the grand theater of court life, and it hurt Liora to see it. While other servants looked away, avoiding Liora's gaze as they carried out their tasks, Liora would occasionally catch the princess's eyes across the room. And each time, she saw something that the others did not. Liora's eyes, violet like the dusk sky, were full of unspoken words, emotions too complex for the cold walls of the castle to contain. Liora noticed the way Liora's fingers fidgeted, how they traced the edges of whatever object was within her reach, sometimes a piece of cloth, sometimes a delicate pendant. The motion was constant, almost compulsive, but to Liora, it wasn't a sign of madness or disconnection. It was a form of communication, a rhythm that only someone willing to look closely would understand. One day, while refilling a silver goblet at the far end of the hall, Liora caught sight of Liora again. This time the princess was seated by the window, a book open in front of her, though she wasn't reading. Her gaze was distant, her fingers turning the pages absently. Liora watched her for a moment, the weight of her isolation sinking in. She had been told of Liora's condition, the way she was different, the way she couldn't speak, couldn't interact with others. It was as if the princess existed on a plane separate from the rest of them, and the rest of them, in turn, had decided to let her be. But Liora couldn't ignore the small signs. The way Liora flinched when someone came too close, the way her eyes brightened when she caught the sound of a song being played, the way she would hum along to the melody in a low, almost inaudible voice. Liora wasn't cold. She wasn't broken. She was simply misunderstood. The realization hit Liora like a wave, one that left her breathless. Here she was, in the midst of a palace filled with beautiful things, rich fabrics, sparkling jewels, elegant courtiers, and yet the one thing that stood out to her was the princess, wrapped in a silence too deep to escape. But it wasn't a silence that should be feared. It was a silence that needed to be understood. Liora had made up her mind. She would reach out to the princess, not out of pity or obligation, but because she saw something in Liora that others refused to acknowledge. She didn't know exactly what that would look like, but she knew that she couldn't just stand by and let the girl remain in the shadows forever. As the days passed, Liora found herself looking for more ways to help, to connect with Liora in whatever small way she could. She noticed the princess's slight movements when someone would speak to her, the way she tensed when touched. Liora quickly learned the princess's patterns, noting the little habits that seemed to bring her comfort, her quiet humming, her tracing of objects, the soft smile she gave when she was alone and undisturbed. These were Liora's ways of communicating, her own form of expression. And Liora would be the one to understand it. One evening, as Liora was making her rounds in the ballroom, she saw Liora again, seated in her usual corner, her crimson gown a stark contrast against the dark shadows around her. The princess was alone, as always. The music played in the background, a haunting waltz that seemed to carry the weight of centuries of forgotten memories. The courtiers danced, their laughter echoing off the marble floors, but none of them even glanced in Liora's direction. Liora stood at the edge of the room, her heart pounding. She knew she had to act. She couldn't let this moment slip by. With slow, deliberate steps, she crossed the ballroom, her shoes clicking softly against the floor. The music seemed to grow quieter as she approached the princess, the air thick with anticipation. Liora hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering at her side. This wasn't like any task she'd been assigned. There was no guidebook for this, but there was one thing she knew. Liora needed someone to see her as a person, not as a puzzle to be solved or a tragedy to be avoided. When Liora reached the princess, she stopped a few feet away, her breath catching in her throat. She waited for Liora to acknowledge her, but the princess remained still, her gaze fixed on the empty floor in front of her. Liora took a deep breath, steadying her nerves. "Would you like to dance with me?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. The words hung in the air, a simple question, but to Liora they were something much more. They were an invitation, a lifeline thrown into the darkness. Liora stood there, her heart in her throat, waiting for a response. At first, there was nothing. No movement, no reaction, just the silence. But then, slowly, Liora's fingers stopped moving and her eyes lifted. They met Liora's gaze, not with the distance Liora had expected, but with something else, something fragile, almost shy, yet undeniably aware. Liora's fingers trembled as they reached out, hovering for a moment before gently brushing against Liora's hand. It was the slightest touch, but it was everything. Liora's breath caught in her chest, and she smiled softly, a warmth spreading through her. She hadn't expected this fragile moment of connection, but here it was. Liora stood slowly, her movements hesitant at first, like a flower opening in the morning light. Liora reached out and took her hand, gently guiding the princess toward the center of the room. The music swelled around them, but this time, it wasn't the beat that moved them. It was something deeper, a rhythm of trust, an unspoken bond that began to form between them in that quiet space. At first, Liora was stiff in her movements, her body rigid as though unsure of what to do. But Liora held her steady, swaying gently, guiding her without pressure. And slowly, Liora's foot shifted, one hesitant step, then another. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And that was all that mattered. The room seemed to fall away, the noise fading into the background. The courtiers continued their dance, but none of them noticed the two figures moving in the center of the ballroom. For the first time in years, the air around Liora shifted, and she was no longer invisible. She was seen. As Liora and Liora danced, a quiet joy began to settle in the air. It was subtle, but unmistakable. And at the edge of the crowd, King Kalin stood, watching his daughter for the first time in a way he hadn't before. His gaze was hard at first, but it softened as he took in the sight before him. His daughter, his once ignored daughter, was dancing. Not with the nobles, not with the courtiers, but with a simple maid who had seen her, truly seen her. Kalin's heart tightened in his chest. He had spent so long pushing her away, so long trying to protect her from a world he couldn't control, but now, watching her take this step, he wondered if it had all been for nothing. The dance continued, the music playing on, but something else had begun, a shift in the castle, in the very air itself. Liora, once hidden in the shadows, was no longer alone. She had been seen, and for the first time in her life, she was free. The dance, as simple as it seemed, was just the beginning. It was the first step in a journey that would take both Liora and her father down a path they had never imagined. But what Liora didn't know was that this single act of kindness had the power to shatter the walls that had kept Liora hidden for so long. And with it, the beginning of a new chapter in Darkwind Castle was written. A chapter where love, in its most unexpected form, would begin to heal old wounds, even those that had been buried for years. The music swelled softly in the background, a haunting waltz that filled the vast, echoing expanse of the grand ballroom. The chandeliers overhead, once dim and flickering, now cast their golden light across the room like a blanket of warmth, spilling over the polished marble floor. The space, though grand and regal, felt empty in its silence, save for the quiet shuffle of Alara's shoes as she guided Princess Liora to the center of the floor. At first, Liora's steps were hesitant, unsure. Her body remained stiff, her movements rigid and cautious, as though she feared the very air around her. But Liora, her hand warm and steady in the princess's, gently guided her, moving slowly, patiently, giving her space to adjust to the unfamiliar rhythm. Liora felt the weight of the princess's uncertainty, the way Liora's body trembled with each tentative step. She had danced alone for so long, and now, in this space filled with light and music, she was asked to trust someone who had not been afraid to see her, even when others had looked away. For a moment, the room fell away. The other servants, going about their duties, barely seemed to notice the two women in the center of the ballroom. The courtiers, always so consumed with themselves, did not turn their heads. Only Liora and Liora existed in this space, connected by the quiet strength of the dance. With each passing beat of the music, Liora's movements softened, as if the rhythm of the dance slowly began to quiet the fears that had taken root in her. Liora's touch was gentle, never demanding, never pushing too hard. The princess began to move more freely, allowing herself to sway, to step, her body slowly finding its own rhythm. There was no need for words between them. The dance spoke for itself. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Liora allowed herself to be vulnerable, to trust. The walls that had held her captive, the walls built by years of neglect and misunderstanding, began to crack just a little. The princess's violet eyes, usually so distant and withdrawn, softened. She turned her head slightly to meet Ilara's gaze, and in that brief moment, Ilara saw something she had never expected to see in the princess, a fragile, tentative smile. Liora was opening up, but just as the princess took another step toward trusting this strange new world, the doors to the ballroom creaked open. The sound was subtle, barely audible, but it was enough to stop Ilara's heart in her chest. King Kalin stood in the doorway. The air in the room shifted. A chill swept through the ballroom, despite the warmth of the candles and the rhythm of the dance. The Wolf King's presence was a force all its own, a dark, looming shadow that seemed to seep into the very walls of the castle. His tall figure, draped in the black fur-lined cloak of the kingdom's rulers, filled the doorway. His sharp gaze swept across the room, and for a brief moment, everything froze. His eyes locked on his daughter, still in Ilara's arms, still swaying gently to the music. His jaw clenched, his chest tightened, and a flood of emotions, the emotions he had buried for so long, pushed to the surface: anger, disbelief, grief. Kalin's first reaction was one of fury. His daughter, the one he had kept hidden, the one he had tried so desperately to shield from the world, was dancing with a mere maid, a servant who had no right to touch her, no right to speak to her, let alone dance with her. His eyes burned with a mixture of rage and confusion, the pain of seeing his daughter alive and well, a daughter he had pushed aside for years. Too much to bear in this moment. How dare this maid, this insignificant servant, approach his daughter? How dare she reach out to her when he had spent so long keeping her at arm's length? He stormed forward, his footsteps echoing like a drumbeat of impending doom. The sound of his heavy boots on the stone floor was enough to rattle the quiet in the room, to draw the attention of the few remaining staff members who scurried out of the way, fearful of crossing the king. Ilara, too, felt the weight of his gaze, and her heart faltered. She knew what was coming, had known it from the moment she reached out to Liora, but she had hoped, foolishly, that perhaps this time would be different. When the king reached them, he stopped. His breath came in short, ragged bursts, as though he had just run a great distance. His crimson eyes locked onto Liora, his daughter, standing in the center of the room, her hand still gently held by Ilara. Enough. Kalin's voice was low, but it carried with the weight of authority. What is this nonsense? Liora flinched at the sound of her father's voice, her eyes darting to the floor, but she did not withdraw her hand from Ilara's. Her body, though tense, remained rooted in place, as if the dance had given her something she hadn't realized she needed. Ilara, on the other hand, stood still, her back straight, her heart pounding, but she refused to let the king's anger sway her. "Your Majesty, I just wanted to—" Ilara began, but her words faltered under the weight of Kalin's stare. Kalin's gaze hardened, his lips curling into a thin, disapproving line. "You think you can just dance with her? Do you think you know what's best for her?" His words were sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. Ilara swallowed hard, but she stood her ground. "She is not just a princess, my lord. She is your daughter. She deserves more than this isolation, more than the silence that has kept her in the shadows." Her voice was soft but firm. "She deserves to be seen." A flicker of something close to regret, flashed in Kalin's eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. He reached out, his hand brushing Liora's shoulder, a gesture that was meant to comfort, but instead caused her to recoil. She flinched away from him, her small body trembling as she turned her face from her father. Kalin's heart twisted, but his pride held him back. "Liora," he said, his voice trembling with the weight of emotions he didn't know how to express. "You're better than this." Liora's response was silent, but Ilara saw the way her shoulders slumped, the way her small fingers curled into a fist. She was breaking. The walls that she had built, the walls that had kept her safe from the world, were crumbling. But it wasn't the anger from her father that caused her to break. It was the fact that she had been ignored, dismissed, and pushed aside for so long. Caelan turned his gaze to Liora, his eyes now filled with a sharp coldness. "Leave her be. Do not approach her again." Liora's heart ached, but she nodded. The dance was over. For now. Tension builds as the evening wore on. The mood in the castle grew heavier. Whispers spread throughout the court like wildfire. The courtiers, who had witnessed the scene from the edges of the ballroom, exchanged nervous glances. The king's wrath had been quick, but it was clear that something more than anger lingered in the air. The court was no stranger to silence, but tonight it was thicker, more suffocating. Caelan's coldness toward his daughter deepened after the incident. He avoided her in the halls, his gaze never lingering on her for too long. When he did look at her, his eyes were filled with the weight of something that he could not bear to face. The more he distanced himself from her, the more Liora seemed to withdraw into herself. She became a ghost in her own home, lingering in the shadows, never seen unless it was absolutely necessary. Caelan couldn't bring himself to reach out to her, not after what had happened, not after the dance. His heart ached, but his pride kept him at a distance. Liora, meanwhile, felt the growing strain of her connection to Liora. The more she reached out, the more Caelan pushed her away. She was warned by the other servants, warned to stay in her place, to avoid the princess. They told her that she was overstepping, that the king would not tolerate anyone questioning his authority. But Liora couldn't turn away now. She couldn't ignore the silent suffering she saw in Liora's eyes, the way the princess longed for something more. She wasn't going to be like the others, pretending to ignore the girl who needed someone to understand her, no matter the cost. The tension in Darkwind Castle continued to grow. The king's silence only added to the weight that hung over the halls. But what Caelan did not know was that this moment, the dance, the connection, was the beginning of something far larger than he could have imagined. As Liora and Liora's bond deepened, the castle, for all its grandeur and glory, would soon find itself shaken to its very core. And it would be up to the maid who dared to see the princess for who she truly was to help both father and daughter break free from the chains that bound them. The corridors of Darkwind Castle had always seemed cold, even on the warmest of days. The stone walls, thick and ancient, absorbed the heat of the sun and held on to it, giving the air inside a certain heaviness. But today, the chill that permeated the castle had nothing to do with the weather. It was the kind of cold that lingered in the bones, a presence that couldn't be ignored. And it came from a place deeper than the physical. It came from the memories that haunted the halls, memories of a queen who was no longer there, but never truly left. Princess Liora felt it most acutely. She always had. The atmosphere in the castle was never still for her. While the others walked through the grand hallways, their conversations barely disturbing the air, Liora's senses were always attuned to the subtle vibrations that others missed. She could feel the way the castle seemed to sigh with each passing moment, the way the wood creaked and the stones settled into place. But it wasn't just the castle she felt. It was the pulse of the kingdom, the rising tension, the hopes and fears of its people, the whispers in the wind that carried the weight of secrets. Liora's sensitivity to the world around her had always been both a gift and a curse. She saw things others couldn't. She heard the whispers in the shadows and felt the emotions that lingered in the spaces between people. The world was louder for her, more vivid, more chaotic. Yet at the same time, it was quieter. It was as if the veil between her and the rest of the kingdom had grown thinner with each passing year, allowing her to perceive everything except the thing she longed to understand most. Her father. The king, her father, remained a distant figure, as cold and unyielding as the stone walls of the castle. He had never tried to understand her. And the more he withdrew, the more Liora retreated into herself, until there was no bridge left between them. But that was before Liora came into her life. Liora had seen her, not as a mystery, but as a person. She had reached out to Liora when no one else had dared to, and in doing so, she had given Liora something she had never known she needed: connection. But even with Ilara's kindness, there were still moments when the silence of the castle became suffocating, when the weight of her isolation grew too much to bear. In those moments, Liora found herself retreating deeper into her own world, a world that felt safer, if not lonelier. It was on one of these quiet nights that Liora felt it the most. She was seated by the window in her room, her fingers tracing the edge of a silver pendant, a gift from her late mother, Queen Isolde. The pendant had been her mother's most treasured possession, a simple piece of jewelry, but one that had held great significance. Liora could remember the way her mother's gentle hands had placed it around her neck when she was just a child, the soft words her mother had whispered to her as the pendant swung from its chain. It was a reminder of something Liora had never fully understood, a connection to a woman she had never truly known. But the pendant had always been a link to her mother, and when Liora held it, she could almost feel the warmth of her mother's presence. Tonight, however, was different. The air in her room shifted, the temperature dropped, and the light from the flickering candles seemed to dim, as if the shadows themselves were deepening. Liora's breath caught in her throat, and for a brief moment the world outside her window faded into nothingness. It was as though the castle itself had fallen silent, holding its breath. And then she heard it. A soft hum, faint but unmistakable, echoing through the walls of the castle. It was a lullaby she had only ever heard in fragments, in dreams, in fleeting moments of memory. The melody was familiar, like something that had been etched into her soul, but the voice singing it was not her own. It was her mother's. Liora's eyes widened. The lullaby, the song she had once heard her mother sing to her when she was small, was filling the room. The presence of it was undeniable. She had always known that her mother's spirit lingered within the castle's walls, that her love had not entirely disappeared with her death. But hearing the song again, hearing it so clearly, was something else entirely. It was a sign. Her heart pounded in her chest. She stood up, her feet moving on their own, carrying her toward the door. The song was calling her, pulling her down the long corridors, as if it had a purpose, as though she were meant to follow it. Liora stepped out of her room, the cold stone of the hallway underfoot, and she began to walk. The hum of the lullaby led her deeper into the castle, farther than she had ever gone. She had no destination in mind, but something inside her, something deep and instinctual, told her she had to keep going. Meanwhile, King Kalin sat in his chambers, his back stiff against the throne, his eyes fixed on the far wall. His thoughts were turbulent, like a storm raging inside him. He had spent years trying to protect his daughter, trying to shield her from the world he feared would never accept her. He had done what he thought was best, keeping her in isolation, keeping her away from the prying eyes of the court, keeping her hidden from the world that had already taken so much from him. But now, as the weight of the past pressed down on him, he couldn't escape the truth. His daughter was not broken. She was not some fragile thing to be hidden away. She was stronger than he had ever given her credit for. He had seen it that night, in the ballroom, when Liora danced with Ilara. There had been something in her movements, something he had never expected to see, that had shaken him to his core. But it wasn't just her strength that haunted him. It was the fear that had lingered in the depths of his heart for years. Fear that her differences were not just a result of her own nature, but of something far darker, a connection to his late wife, Queen Isolde, that Kalin could never fully understand. The memory of Isolde's death still gripped him like a vice. Her loss had torn him apart, leaving a void he had never been able to fill. He had tried, in his own way, to protect Liora from that pain, to keep her safe from the world's cruelty. But now, as he sat alone in his chambers, he couldn't shake the fear that his daughter's sensitivity, her unique gifts, were somehow linked to the loss of his wife. Could Liora's differences be the result of something more than just her condition? Could they be connected to the curse he had feared all along? The thought gnawed at him, pulling him deeper into a pit of fear and uncertainty. As Liora followed the lullaby through the castle, she reached a hidden alcove near the castle's ancient wing. The song had led her here, to a room she had never seen before, one that seemed to pulse with an energy all its own. It was a place she had been drawn to, as though the very walls of the castle were calling her to this spot. Inside the room, the air was thick with the scent of jasmine and roses, Isolde's favorite flowers. The walls were lined with portraits, and at the center of the room stood a large mirror, its surface fogged as if it held secrets within its depths. Liora stepped closer to the mirror, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch its surface. And then she saw it, a shadowy figure, her mother, standing before her, as real as the air around her. Isolde's face, her gentle smile, the same warmth Liora had longed to feel. The princess froze, her heart racing as she realized she was not alone. Her mother's spirit was here, in this room, calling to her. For the first time in years, Liora felt the comfort of her mother's presence, the love that had been lost with her death, the strength she had never fully understood. She wasn't just seeing a ghost, she was feeling her mother's soul, her love, wrapping around her like a protective cloak. As she stood there, the music fading into silence, Liora's mind opened to something new, a truth she had never fully grasped. Her gifts, her sensitivity, her ability to feel the world in ways others couldn't. It wasn't a curse, it was a connection to her mother, to the love that had transcended death. But in that moment, she also understood something else, something that would change everything. Her gifts were not just a link to the past, they were a key to the future. Back in the king's chambers, Kalin sat with his head in his hands, the weight of the past and the future pressing down on him. His mind wandered, consumed by thoughts of his daughter, the princess he had tried so hard to protect. But now, as he thought of her strength, her unique gifts, his heart wavered. He couldn't bear the thought of losing her as he had lost Isolde. But perhaps, just perhaps, it was time to stop shielding her from the world. And so, with a heavy heart, Kalin rose to his feet, knowing the time had come. The time had come to face the truth. The time had come to embrace his daughter for who she truly was. But could he? Could he set aside his fear and pride and allow himself to love her without restraint? The question lingered in the air like a ghost, one that would haunt him for days to come. Liora's strength was undeniable, but so too was the king's fear. The castle halls were adorned with opulence, draped in silks and velvet, sparkling with candlelight and glimmering jewels. The air was thick with anticipation, and the grand ballroom buzzed with excitement. It was the night of the Ball of the Crescent Moon, a celebration held every year to commemorate the Wolf King's reign. The nobles of the kingdom, draped in their finest furs and silks, gathered in the massive hall, their laughter and conversations echoing off the stone walls. But for all the grandeur and merriment, one thing was missing: the presence of the princess. Liora had always avoided these events, her father's wish that she remain in the shadows too powerful to defy. He had insisted that she stay hidden, out of sight, as if her mere presence at such a gathering would undermine the kingdom's stability. For years, Liora had acquiesced to his wishes, staying in the background, a silent figure in the corners of the castle. But tonight, things were different. Tonight, she had made a decision. Elara, her steadfast companion, and the one person who had never looked at her with pity or fear, had encouraged her to attend. She had been there every step of the way, offering gentle guidance and support. Elara had seen something in Liora that others hadn't, and she had never hesitated to show her that she was not broken. Her words, quiet but firm, had planted a seed of courage in Liora's heart. "You're not meant to hide away in the shadows forever," Elara had said the night before. "You deserve to be seen, to live without fear. Go, Liora. Show them who you really are." Liora had hesitated at first, the familiar fear of being judged, of being misunderstood, crawling into her chest. But there was a quiet strength growing within her, a determination she hadn't felt before. She wasn't the fragile Sai. Silent girl her father thought her to be. She wasn't just his daughter to be protected. She was more than that. She was a person with her own voice, her own dreams, and her own desires. And tonight, she would take the first step toward claiming them. Kalen, the Wolf King, stood at the top of the grand staircase, his back straight, his posture impeccable. He surveyed the ballroom, his gaze sharp and calculating, taking in every detail of the celebration. The nobles had gathered in their finest attire, the soft glow of candles lighting the room, their laughter rising like music in the air. It was a night for revelry, for the kingdom to honor his reign, for the people to show their respect. But there was a tension in the air, one that Kalen couldn't shake. He had watched the preparation for this night with the same detached interest he had given every other royal occasion, but tonight felt different. It was the quiet knowledge that Liora, his daughter, was supposed to be here. She had always been expected to attend the ball, to stand beside him, to play her role as the princess. Yet Kalen had told her to stay in the shadows, to avoid the public eye, to remain hidden. The whispers, the rumors, they would have been too much for her, and he had done what he thought was best. He told himself it was out of love. That keeping her away from the court's prying eyes was the right thing to do, the only way to shield her from the cruelty of the world. But deep down, a part of him feared that if she were ever seen, if she ever took the step to step into the world he had kept her from, it would unravel everything, his kingdom, his power, his control. And yet, as the night wore on, Kalen's thoughts were never far from her. The silence between them weighed on him. His heart ached when he thought of his daughter, isolated in her room, alone with her thoughts, hidden away in the darkest corner of the castle. Tonight, though, that silence was broken. The moment came when he saw her, Liora, standing at the entrance to the ballroom, her delicate figure framed by the grand archway. For a heartbeat, time seemed to stop. She was no longer the fragile girl he had kept away. She was different now, stronger, her head held high, her eyes bright with something Kalen hadn't seen before. She wasn't the same Liora he had hidden from the world. This was a woman, a princess, stepping into the light for the first time. She was free, and she had done it without him. Liora took a slow step into the ballroom, her breath catching in her chest. The music swirled around her, the sound of violins and flutes filling the air, but she couldn't hear the music. Not in the way the others did. She could feel the rhythm, the pulse of it deep within her. It was a strange sensation, as though the very heartbeat of the kingdom had reached her, calling her to dance. She had never expected to feel so alive. The grand chandeliers above her glittered with thousands of flickering candles, casting golden light over the polished marble floors. The court was still, the nobles frozen in place as they turned to look at her. Liora didn't look away. She stood tall, her heart racing, her pulse quickening in her chest. She could feel the weight of their gazes, but this time it didn't crush her. This time she stood firm, and then Alara appeared beside her, offering her hand with a smile that reached her eyes. "Shall we?" she asked, her voice soft but confident. Liora's gaze flickered toward her, and for a moment her body hesitated. She could see the court around her, the court that had once been her prison. The faces that had turned away from her, the whispers that had followed her every step, and yet, in Alara's eyes, she saw nothing but acceptance. For the first time in her life, she felt seen, truly seen, and in that moment, she knew what she had to do. With a deep breath, Liora placed her hand in Alara's, and together they stepped into the center of the ballroom. The music swelled, and Liora moved. The first step was awkward, tentative, but the rhythm flowed through her, and soon her body found its place. She swirled and twirled, her gown flowing behind her like a river of silk, the hem brushing the floor in time with her steps. For the first time in her life, Liora wasn't afraid to move, to let herself be part of something bigger than the walls of the castle. The court watched in stunned silence. Whispers passed through the crowd like wildfire, but Liora didn't care. She was dancing, not for them, but for herself. She was breaking free. King Kaelin watched from across the room, his heart pounding in his chest, his eyes locked on his daughter, his gaze filled with disbelief. Liora, the girl he had kept hidden, the girl he had tried to protect, was dancing. She was alive, moving in a way he had never seen before. She was beautiful. For a moment, the king's emotions were a storm, crashing against the walls of his heart. He wanted to call out to her, to drag her back into the shadows where he thought she belonged, but something stopped him, something he couldn't name. There was a rawness in her movements, a strength that he had never given her credit for. He saw now, in the way she moved, that she was more than just his daughter. She was a force unto herself, a presence that had been hidden for far too long. He stood there, frozen in place, caught between pride and fear. The fear that by allowing her to step into the world, by allowing her to dance, he had lost control, but there was also pride, a swelling feeling in his chest that he had never allowed himself to feel before. Liora was everything he had kept from the world, and yet she was everything he needed her to be. As the music continued, Liora danced on, her steps growing more fluid, more confident. The silence that had once surrounded her was now replaced with the sound of her own heartbeat, the rhythm of her own soul. She was no longer the girl who had been hidden away. She was a princess, a woman, and tonight she was free. But as the night went on, Kaelin's conflict deepened. The sight of his daughter, so full of life and strength, made him question everything he had done. Had he been wrong? Had he kept her locked away for too long, afraid of losing control? But it was too late for questions. The damage had been done. And Liora, with Alara by her side, had taken control of her own destiny. The ball of the crescent moon would forever mark the turning point in Liora's journey, a night where she shed the skin of her past and danced freely into the future. But it was also the night when Kaelin's world began to unravel, the weight of his decisions crashing down on him. What he hadn't realized was that by hiding his daughter, he had been hiding from himself. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The silence of Darkwind Castle had been broken, and it would never return to the way it had been. The question now was what would come next for the king, his daughter, and the kingdom they were meant to rule together. The full moon hung in the sky, casting a soft silver glow over Darkwind Castle. The grandeur of the night, with its shimmering stars and the gentle rustle of the wind through the tall, ancient trees surrounding the fortress, seemed at odds with the tension that gripped the heart of the castle. Inside, the halls were quiet, save for the faint creaks of the stone walls and the distant sound of footsteps echoing on the marble floors. Liora stood in front of a large mirror in the hallway, her reflection showing the woman she had become. Her crimson gown shimmered in the dim light, a stark contrast to the cold, shadowed corridors that led deeper into the heart of the castle. She had danced that night, the night of the ball of the crescent moon, and for the first time she had felt the weight of her own body in motion, the rhythm of her heart in sync with the world around her. But now, as she gazed into her own eyes, a quiet sadness lingered there, as though something still eluded her. It was the silence between her and her father, the silence that had stretched on for so many years, an invisible wall built by fear, grief, and misunderstanding. She had taken the first step that night, dancing in front of the court, showing them who she truly was, who she could be. But there was more to be done, more to understand. She had stepped into the light, but there was one person she had yet to reach. King Kaelin, her father. The thought of him brought a flutter to her chest, a mixture of longing and uncertainty. Her father, the mighty Wolf King, the ruler of the kingdom, had kept her in the shadows for so long. He had kept her safe, yes, but at what cost? He had protected her from the world, but in doing so, he had isolated her. And in turn, he had isolated himself from her. Alara's voice echoed in her mind, soft and encouraging. "You're not meant to stay in the shadows forever, Liora. You have a place in the light, But the question remained, would her father ever see her, truly see her, for who she was? Could they ever break through the years of distance between them? It was in the quiet moments of the night that Kaelin found himself struggling with his own thoughts. The corridors of the castle were still, the festivities long since ended, and the moonlight spilled in through the tall windows, casting long shadows over the grand hallways. His eyes were tired, the weight of the past pressing on his shoulders as he walked through the castle alone. His cloak swirled around him like the night itself, a reminder of the man he had been, the ruler of a kingdom, the leader of wolves, the king who had lost so much. Tonight, he had watched his daughter dance. For the first time in years, she had stepped into the light, defying his wishes and the rules he had set to protect her. The sight of her, moving gracefully across the ballroom floor, had stirred something in him, a longing he had buried deep within his heart. His daughter was no longer the fragile, broken girl he had kept hidden away. She was strong, she was beautiful, and she had finally chosen to live. But it was also a reminder of everything he had failed to do, everything he had kept from her. He couldn't keep running from the truth, from the grief that had shaped his life since the day his wife, Queen Isolde, had died. Her death had torn him apart. It had shattered him, and in his pain, he had built walls around himself, around his daughter, around his heart. He had never allowed himself to fully love her, not the way a father should, not the way Isolde would have wanted him to, and now, as he walked through the empty halls of his castle, he realized that he had been living in that grief for far too long. Liora walked slowly toward the throne room, her steps deliberate. She knew this conversation was inevitable. She could feel it in the air, like a storm about to break. Tonight, there would be no more running from the silence. Tonight, she would confront her father. As she approached the doors to the throne room, she paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. This wasn't going to be easy. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew one thing. She couldn't keep living in the shadows of her father's grief. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when they were both so broken inside. With a steady hand, she pushed open the doors. Kaelin stood in front of the grand fireplace, his back to her, his shoulders tense. The flames flickered, casting shadows across his face, but Liora could still see the sorrow etched into his features. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Liora broke the silence. "Father, we need to talk." Kaelin's head turned slowly, his piercing gaze locking onto hers. There was a flicker of something in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or hesitation, but he didn't turn away. He didn't retreat into the cold fortress of his heart. "What is it, Liora?" His voice was low, strained, as if he had been holding on to something for far too long. "I can't keep living like this," she said, her voice steady but full of emotion. "You've kept me hidden away in this castle, and for what? To protect me from the world, from the pain." She took a step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "I've spent my whole life waiting for you to see me, for you to love me, but it feels like you've been trying to protect me from your own grief instead." Kaelin's face darkened, and he took a step back, his jaw tightening. "You don't understand," he muttered. "You don't know what it's like to lose everything, to lose her." His voice cracked, but he quickly regained his composure. Leora's chest tightened at the mention of her mother. She had never known Queen Isolde, but she had always felt her presence in the castle. The stories her father had told her, the portrait that hung in the grand hall. But it wasn't just the loss of her mother that haunted Kaelin. It was the weight of his own guilt. "I know that I've been hard on you," Kaelin continued, his voice softening. "I've kept you in the shadows because I was afraid. Afraid that if I let you go, if I let you be free, I would lose you the way I lost her." Leora's heart ached at his words. She had always known that her father's distance was born from pain, but hearing him admit it felt like a blow to her chest. She had always seen the king as an unmovable force, but now she saw the cracks in his armor. "You've been holding on to your grief for so long." "Father," Liora said, her voice filled with understanding. But I'm not her. I'm me. I'm your daughter. And I need you to see me for who I am. Not for who you think I should be. Not for what you lost. Kaelin's eyes flickered with something, perhaps shame, perhaps something deeper. He turned away from her, his gaze shifting to the flickering fire. I've tried to protect you, he said quietly, but I've only kept you locked away. And now I don't know what to do. I'm afraid of losing you the way I lost her. I'm afraid of seeing you disappear from my life, the way she did. Liora moved closer to him, her heart aching with empathy. She had never known her mother, but in that moment she understood. Her father wasn't afraid of her differences. He was afraid of the pain he had buried for so long. He was afraid of truly letting her live, of allowing himself to love her fully. I'm not going anywhere, Father, she said softly, placing a hand on his arm. I'm right here. I'm still your daughter, no matter what. The king's eyes closed for a moment, a tear slipping down his cheek. He hadn't allowed himself to cry in years, but now, with the weight of his emotions pressing on him, he couldn't hold it in any longer. I've failed you, he whispered, his voice breaking. I've failed you as a father. Liora shook her head. No, Father. You haven't failed me. You've just been lost. We've both been lost, but we don't have to be anymore. We can heal, together. Kaelin turned to face her, his eyes filled with a raw, vulnerable emotion that he had kept hidden for so long. How do we begin? Liora smiled, a small but genuine smile. We start by seeing each other. Truly seeing each other. And we don't hide anymore. For the first time in years, the walls between father and daughter began to crumble. The years of silence, of grief, of fear, were not easily washed away, but in this moment they had taken the first step toward healing. And while the road ahead would be long and uncertain, Liora knew that she wasn't alone anymore. She had her father, and her father had her. And that was enough to begin with. The tension in Darkwind Castle had shifted. The air, once thick with the silent rift between father and daughter, now seemed charged with something else. Something more dangerous. The kingdom, long protected by Kaelin's iron grip, was beginning to crack. Beneath the surface of the regal festivities and carefully constructed appearances, a current of unrest was growing. Liora had felt it first. It was more than just the whispers in the halls, the way the courtiers exchanged looks when they thought no one was paying attention. It was the way the earth itself seemed to shift under her feet, as though the very foundation of the kingdom was trembling. She could feel it in the air, in the way the wind howled differently at night, in the way the servants spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting about like frightened animals. Liora had always been attuned to the smallest shifts in her surroundings. Her heightened sensitivity, the gift that had once made her feel like an outsider, was now becoming her greatest strength. It was no longer just about sensing the emotions of the people around her. It was about understanding the flow of the kingdom itself. And something was wrong. Alara stood by her side, watching the young princess with concern. The maid had grown accustomed to Liora's quiet strength, but she could see the tension in the princess's eyes. Her gaze flickered toward the distant horizon, her hand tightening around the silver pendant that had once belonged to her mother. Liora's senses were not simply picking up on emotions, they were feeling the pulse of something far more ominous. You feel it too, don't you? Alara asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Liora nodded, her eyes distant. There's something wrong. The court, the nobles, they're not happy with the changes. With me. They think my father has been weakened. Alara's brow furrowed. But your father, he's stronger than that. He's not someone who can be undermined. Liora's lips tightened into a thin line. It's not about him, Alara. It's about me. They think I'm a weakness. The maid's heart sank at the quiet determination in the princess's voice. What do we do? Liora turned to her, her violet eyes meeting Alara's with an intensity that made her shiver. "We prepare. We've faced this before, only in different forms. We've only ever hidden from it. Now, it's time to face it." Kaelin, the Wolf King, had spent years building his power, solidifying his rule with an iron fist. But beneath the strength of his reign, there were cracks, small fissures that had gone unnoticed, but now they were spreading. A faction within the kingdom, disgruntled with his rule and fearful of the changes happening within the royal family, had begun to stir. They believed that the presence of Liora, her influence over the court, and her newfound courage was a sign of Kaelin's faltering grip. The princess, once kept hidden and out of sight, was now stepping into the light, and with that, the nobles and courtly factions that had thrived on Kaelin's rigidity saw an opportunity to strike. Liora's role, though still misunderstood by many, had become a source of fear for those who thrived on the kingdom's past structure. They saw her as a symbol of change, a change they did not welcome. Kaelin had heard the murmurs of unrest, but he had refused to acknowledge them. He had spent so many years shielding himself from the reality of his daughter's differences, and now they were bringing him face to face with the harsh truth. The world outside his walls was beginning to notice, and they didn't like what they saw. It was late one evening when the first sign of rebellion came. A messenger arrived at the castle gates, his face pale and lined with fear. He carried news of a gathering, one that was already taking place in the distant northern territories. A faction of nobles, led by disgruntled lords and exiled generals, had united under the banner of those who opposed Kaelin's reign. Their message was clear. Liora's presence as a public figure, her growing influence, was a threat to the stability of the kingdom. If the king did not act swiftly, they would strike. Kaelin, who had been sitting alone in the war room, staring into the dark expanse beyond his castle walls, felt the weight of the news settle on him like a stone. He knew the faces of these rebels, men and women who had long desired more power, who had plotted in the shadows, waiting for a weakness to exploit, and now they had found it in his daughter. "Do we have an army?" Kaelin asked, his voice low, controlled. The captain of the guard, a stoic man with graying hair and the bearing of a soldier who had seen too much, stood at attention. "We can raise one, my lord, but we cannot underestimate them. They have a sizable force, and their reach is growing." The king clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. He had fought wars before, fought battles with the confidence that his strength, his rule, would win the day. But now, faced with the possibility of losing control, not over his enemies, but over his own daughter, he felt powerless. Liora's role in this conflict was unclear to him. Was she the cause of this rebellion? Or was she simply caught in the midst of it? He had spent so many years keeping her at arm's length, trying to shield her from a world that would never understand her, that he had never once stopped to consider what she might be capable of. Later that night, Kaelin sought out his daughter in the quiet solitude of her chambers. He had to speak to her. There was no more avoiding it. The rebellion, the unrest, the shifting dynamics within his own court, everything was coming to a head, and he could no longer bury his head in the sand. Liora was sitting by the window, her eyes gazing out into the night, her fingers lightly tracing the pendant she always wore. She was lost in thought, and Kaelin couldn't help but notice how much she had changed. Where once there was a girl who had been confined to the shadows, there was now a woman who had the courage to face the light and to face him. He stepped into the room, his presence filling the space, and Liora turned to him, her gaze steady. "Father," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. Kaelin sighed, his shoulders sagging as he took a step closer. "Liora, we need to talk." She didn't say anything at first, just watched him with those deep violet eyes, as though waiting for him to speak. Her silence wasn't cold. It was simply the way she saw the world, the way she felt it. He could almost hear the world turning in her mind, 1,000 thoughts that he could never fully grasp. "I know about the rebellion," he continued, the words heavy with a mixture of fear and regret. "I know they're trying to use you against me." Leora's expression didn't change. She had already known. She had always known. "They think I'm a weakness," she said quietly. "They think my presence will undermine you." "They're wrong," Kalen replied, his voice harsh. "I know that." "But do you?" Liora asked, her voice tinged with something sharp. "Do you truly believe that, Father? Or are you just saying it because it's what you think you should say?" Kalen's heart clenched at her words. For so long, he had kept her at arm's length, believing that he was protecting her, but now, standing before her, he realized that it had been he who had been protected, from the truth, from the reality of who she was. Liora was not a weakness. She was a strength, one that he had denied, one that he had failed to see. "I see it now," Kalen said quietly, his voice breaking the silence. "I've failed you. I've spent so many years afraid of losing you that I've kept you from truly living." Liora shook her head, her eyes softening. "You didn't fail me, Father. You were afraid, and I understand that now, but we don't have to be afraid anymore." Kalen looked at her, his heart heavy with the weight of the past. The pain of his wife's death, the loss he had never fully recovered from, had been the driving force behind his actions. He had kept Liora hidden, kept her away from the world, because he was terrified of losing her too. But in doing so, he had nearly lost her forever. The rebellion was a wake-up call, a brutal reminder of his own shortcomings. He had been blind to the fact that his daughter, his beloved Liora, was not the fragile girl he had tried to protect. She was capable of more than he had ever given her credit for, and it was time for him to acknowledge that. "Together," Kalen said, his voice gaining strength, "we'll face this rebellion, and we'll show them that you are no weakness. You are the future of this kingdom, Liora, and I will never hide you again." Liora smiled, a smile that was equal parts relief and determination. "Then let's begin." With their shared understanding, father and daughter stood side by side, ready to face the threat that loomed over the kingdom. The rebellion was a test, not just of their rule, but of their bond, and as the tension in the kingdom mounted, Kalen and Liora knew they had no choice but to confront the forces that sought to tear them apart. The future of the kingdom and of their family rested in their hands. The hall was quiet now, the last echoes of celebration fading into the cool night air that swept through the open windows of Darkwind Castle. The grand ballroom, once filled with the tumultuous energy of nobles and courtiers, now stood empty, bathed in the soft light of the flickering candles and the glow of the crescent moon outside. The silence was not oppressive, but peaceful, an almost tangible calm that settled over the room like a blanket. Liora stood near the center of the floor, her fingers brushing the edge of her gown as she gazed around the space. The once foreboding ballroom, with its towering chandeliers and polished marble floors, no longer felt like a cage. Tonight, it felt like a sanctuary, a place where memories were made and where the weight of the past could finally be shed. The kingdom had been saved, not through force or violence, but through understanding and connection. Liora had faced the rebellion head-on, her unique gifts allowing her to see the signs of unrest before anyone else had noticed. With Alara by her side, they had helped navigate the tension that had threatened to tear apart the kingdom, and in doing so, they had begun to heal the fractured relationship between Liora and her father, King Kalen. Now, standing alone in the ballroom, Liora felt the weight of what had been accomplished and what was still to come. The king was not the man he once had been. His walls had come down, the armor he had worn for so many years had cracked, and for the first time he had allowed himself to truly see her, to love her, to trust her. But there was one final piece left to complete their healing. Liora turned as she heard footsteps approaching. Her father, Kalen, stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the moonlight that poured in from the garden. His broad shoulders, once so rigid with the weight of his crown, were now relaxed. The lines of grief and fear that had marked his face for so long were slowly beginning to soften, replaced by something new, something she had never seen before. Hope. He stepped into the room, his dark cloak swaying behind him, and for a moment he just stood there, looking at his daughter. There was no need for words. None were necessary. In the silence, in the space between them, they both understood. Then, Kaelin extended his hand, his fingers trembling ever so slightly, a reflection of the vulnerability he had never before allowed himself to show. "Liora," he said, his voice low but steady. "Would you dance with me?" For a heartbeat, Liora stood still, her heart pounding in her chest. She had dreamed of this moment for so long, the moment when her father would finally see her, not as a symbol of his failure, but as his daughter. But it was more than that. It was the moment when their family, broken and divided for so many years, would finally come together. A smile, soft and genuine, spread across her face. She stepped forward, placing her hand in his. "Yes, Father, I would love to." The music began, slow and gentle, filling the air with a melody that seemed to breathe life into the room. The orchestra, which had long since gone silent, played with a delicate grace, as though they too understood the significance of the moment. The violins whispered, the cellos hummed, and the entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Liora placed her other hand on Kaelin's shoulder, her fingers trembling with both excitement and emotion. For the first time, she felt no fear. There was no hesitation, no need to hide. This was not a dance of obligation, nor one of formality. This was a dance of unity, a dance of love. Kaelin led her across the floor, his movements slow at first, cautious as though testing the waters of this new relationship they were forging. But as they moved together, as they swayed in rhythm with the music, something shifted between them. The space between their bodies, once distant and cold, began to close. The weight of the past, of his grief, of their silence, began to lift. Liora rested her head against her father's chest, hearing the steady beat of his heart beneath the fabric of his tunic. The familiar rhythm was comforting, grounding her in the moment. It was not just her own heartbeat that she felt in her chest, but his, the beat of their shared history, of their shared blood. Kaelin too seemed to relax. The tension in his shoulders, the furrow of his brow, softened with each step they took together. His hand, once so stiff and unyielding, was warm against hers, guiding her with a tenderness she had never known he possessed. For the first time in years, Kaelin allowed himself to simply be present, not as a king, not as a ruler, but as a father who had made mistakes, who had let grief cloud his judgment, who had feared his daughter's differences instead of embracing them. But here, in this moment, he was learning to let go, to let the walls fall. He leaned down, his voice barely a whisper as he spoke to Liora, his words almost lost in the music. "I'm sorry, Liora, for everything, for the years I spent keeping you away from the world, keeping you from me." Leora's heart clenched, but she smiled softly, her eyes meeting his. "It's okay, Father. We're here now. That's all that matters." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of years of unspoken pain. And in that moment, Liora knew that her father had finally heard her, not just with his ears, but with his heart. As they danced, the ghosts of the past began to fade. The echoes of Queen Isolde's presence, once so heavy in the castle, softened into a bittersweet memory. Her love, her spirit, had been the bond that had once held Kaelin and Liora together, but it was time for that love to be released. It was time for them to move forward, to build something new. The dance seemed to last an eternity, but in the best way. There was no rush, no urgency. It was simply the two of them, moving together in quiet harmony, letting the music carry them through the pain, the loss, and the years of silence. When the song came to an end, Kaelin and Liora stood still in the center of the ballroom, their arms still around each other, their hearts beating in time. The orchestra's final note faded into silence, and the world seemed to hold its breath once more. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was no need for words. Finally, Caelan pulled away, but not completely. He looked at Liora, his eyes filled with something that wasn't just pride or sorrow. It was love. Deep, unspoken love. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for showing me that there's more to life than fear." Liora smiled, her eyes sparkling with unspoken joy. "We have a lifetime to figure it out, Father. Together." As the dance came to its end, Liora, who had been watching from the sidelines, felt a soft pang of bittersweet pride in her chest. She had been a silent witness to this moment, to the healing of a family that had been broken by grief and fear. But her role in this story was drawing to a close. Her work, the quiet support she had given Liora, the gentle push to help her step into the light, was finished. There was nothing more for her to do. She had helped bridge the gap between father and daughter, and now it was time for her to leave. Liora turned her head and caught sight of Liora standing by the door, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. With a soft smile, she motioned for Liora to come closer. "Are you leaving?" Liora asked, her voice filled with the gentleness that had become her trademark since that first dance with Liora. Liora nodded, stepping forward with a bittersweet smile. "It's time, Princess. You and your father have found your way. There's nothing more for me here." Liora's heart ached at the thought of losing her. Liora had been the light in the darkness, the one person who had truly seen her. But she understood. They both understood. Liora had given them the space to heal, and now her presence wasn't needed in the same way. She had done what she came here to do. "Thank you," Liora whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Liora smiled, her eyes soft with love. "You don't need to thank me, Princess. You've always had this strength within you. You just needed someone to remind you of it." With one last look at her, Liora turned and walked toward the door. As she left the ballroom, she knew that her time in the kingdom was over. She had given everything she could, and now it was time for Liora to take her place in the world. As the last notes of music faded into the quiet of the night, Caelan and Liora stood together, no longer father and daughter held apart by silence, but two people who had found each other in the wreckage of the past. The king's heart, once cold and hardened by grief, had been softened by love. And the princess, who had spent her life in the shadows, had finally stepped into the light. And together they danced, not as rulers and subjects, but as a family, reunited. A family that had healed, and now would face whatever the future held, together. The last dance was more than just a symbolic gesture. It was the closing of an old chapter and the beginning of a new one. A new era for Caelan, for Liora, and for Darkwind Castle. And though the road ahead was uncertain, they knew they would face it side by side. With Alara's departure, a new sense of unity had been forged in the heart of the kingdom, and the future, once shrouded in darkness, now gleamed with possibility. The sun had risen over Darkwind Castle, casting its first golden rays across the kingdom below. For the first time in years, the castle felt alive in a way it hadn't before. The grand stone walls that had once felt like a prison now seemed to pulse with possibility. The distant sound of birdsong carried on the morning breeze. The kingdom was changing, and so were the people within it. King Caelan stood on the balcony of the castle's highest tower, gazing out over the lands that had once been ruled by fear and control. The land was still vast and untamed, but now there was a sense of peace that had been absent for so long. The whisper of the wind through the trees, the laughter of children in the streets below, it was all different. His kingdom was no longer a place of rigid hierarchy and silence. It was a place of warmth, of understanding, and most importantly, of acceptance. Liora, his daughter, stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on the railing. Her presence, once a symbol of weakness to some, had become the heart of the kingdom's transformation. Her gifts that had once been misunderstood, even feared, were now celebrated. She was no longer the isolated princess hidden away in the shadows. She was a leader in her own right, a woman who had come into her power and was helping guide the kingdom into a new era. The air between them was different now. Once filled with unspoken grief and a heavy silence, it now thrummed with the quiet strength of two people who had learned to love and trust each other in ways they had never thought possible. The people of Darkwind Castle had witnessed the changes firsthand. The once cold and distant court now brimmed with life. The courtiers, who had once whispered behind closed doors, now spoke openly of Liora's abilities, of her wisdom, and of the kindness she had shown to the kingdom's citizens. Where once there had been fear and uncertainty, there was now respect and admiration. It had not been easy, and the journey had been long, but the kingdom had finally embraced what it had once rejected. In the village beyond the castle walls, merchants and farmers greeted the princess with smiles, no longer casting furtive glances as they had in the past. They recognized her not as a fragile, broken girl, but as a leader who would help guide them through the challenges they faced. And Kaelin, who had once seen his daughter's difference as something to be hidden, now saw her strength and her wisdom as the very thing that would lead the kingdom into a brighter future. As they stood together, looking out over the lands, Liora turned to her father, her violet eyes filled with a sense of calm confidence. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Kaelin smiled, his once tired eyes now filled with pride. "We have, and I've learned more than I ever thought possible." Liora laughed softly, a sound that was full of joy and freedom. "I don't think we're finished yet, though. There's still so much to do." Kaelin's gaze softened as he looked at his daughter. "You're right. But now we do it together, as equals. You've shown me the way forward, Liora. I couldn't be prouder of you." She smiled, her heart swelling with a quiet warmth. It was a love that had been forged in the deepest fires of grief and fear, but now it was a love that would endure. She had seen the strength in her father that he had hidden from the world for so long. And now, together, they would face whatever came next, no longer as king and princess, but as father and daughter, united in love and purpose. Liora's role in the kingdom had grown far beyond that of a mere symbol. She had proven herself to be a leader, a woman with a unique understanding of the world around her. Her gifts, her heightened sensitivity, her ability to sense emotions and read the pulse of the kingdom had become invaluable to Kaelin. She could feel the ebb and flow of unrest before it reached the streets, and she could sense the needs of the people long before they voiced them. Her gifts allowed her to act with wisdom and insight, guiding the kingdom with a steady hand. And it wasn't just her abilities that had made her so respected. It was the way she had used them. Liora had never tried to force her will on the people of the kingdom. She had never sought power for power's sake. Instead, she had listened, truly listened, to those around her. She had shown them that they were seen and heard, that their needs mattered, and in return, they had embraced her, offering her their loyalty and respect. "Father," Liora said, her voice breaking through his thoughts, "I want to do more. There's so much more I can offer, if you'll let me." Kaelin turned to her, his expression softening. "Anything, Liora. You've already done more than I could ever have imagined." She looked down for a moment, her fingers tracing the railing of the balcony. "I want to help rebuild the kingdom, not just the walls of the castle, but the hearts of the people. I want to be there for them, in the way that you've been there for me." Kaelin's heart swelled with pride. "You already have, Liora. You've shown them that there's more to leadership than power. You've shown them the strength of compassion." Liora smiled, her eyes bright with determination. "I think we're both learning that now." The changes in Darkwind Castle were not limited to the court or the kingdom's leadership. The very people themselves had changed too. The kingdom, once divided by fear and suspicion, was now united by a shared sense of purpose. The fear that had once gripped the land had been replaced by hope, and with that hope came prosperity. The kingdom flourished, and Kaelin and Liora worked side by side to ensure that the growth was not just political or economic, but cultural as well. They championed the arts, the sciences, and the value of education. Liora encouraged the people to express themselves, to create, to dream, and in turn, the kingdom's people did just that, creating a vibrant, thriving society where everyone's voice was valued. As the days passed, Kaelin and Liora spent more time together, not just as rulers, but as family. They took walks in the gardens, where the flowers bloomed with the colors of renewal, and they sat together by the fire, speaking of the future. They shared their thoughts, their hopes, and even their fears. It was a relationship built on understanding and respect, a bond forged through years of struggle and reconciliation. One evening, as they walked through the castle grounds, Liora turned to her father with a thoughtful expression on her face. "Father," she said, her voice gentle, "do you ever think about what comes next? About the future of our kingdom?" Kaelin looked at her, his expression pensive. "Every day, but I no longer fear the future, Liora. I see it now, not as something that will crush us, but as something we can build together." Liora smiled softly, the weight of his words sinking into her heart. "We will. Together." As they stood beneath the stars, the kingdom around them alive with the promise of a bright future, Kaelin and Liora knew that the journey was far from over. There would be challenges ahead, obstacles to overcome, but they no longer faced them alone. They faced them as a family, strong, united, and ready to create a kingdom where love, acceptance, and understanding would always reign. And in that moment, Kaelin realized something that he had never allowed himself to believe before, that he had not only gained back his daughter, but he had gained a kingdom, one that was not built on fear, but on the love they had forged together. The future was theirs to shape. And for the first time in years, Kaelin and Liora knew that they could face whatever came next, together. The road to this moment had been long and fraught with challenges, but the kingdom's journey was just beginning. The seeds of change had been planted, and now, under the leadership of Kaelin and Liora, Darkwind Castle would become a symbol of hope and unity. The scars of the past had been healed, and the future, bright and full of promise, lay before them. Together, they would lead the kingdom into a new era of peace, prosperity, and understanding, a future where no one was ever hidden and where every voice mattered.